I didn't shed a single tear at my father's funeral. Not when the organ moaned out a hymn so ancient it felt like the walls themselves had memorized every note. Not when the casket rolled down the aisle in a slow, deliberate procession, as if passing judgment on everyone it passed. Not even when my Aunt Evelyn Parker leaned in with that razor-thin smile of hers and whispered, "He only ever loved one child, and it wasn't her." Her words struck like a slap of ice-cold water against my spine, making me sit up a little too straight. My throat constricted as if her voice had somehow wrapped itself around my windpipe. My fingers curled into the memorial program resting on my lap, the kind printed on cheap, shiny paper that crackled loudly under pressure, a small, pathetic sound in such a cavernous space. Then right on cue, her son, my cousin Jake Parker, the self-anointed golden boy of the family, let out a smug chuckle. Not loud, but sharp enough for the row behind us to catch it. He leaned back with the lazy confidence of someone who never had to fight for approval. He used to call her his biggest regret. He muttered, voice smooth and casual, but aimed like a dagger. I didn't react, kept my eyes glued to the casket. If I turned, they'd see at the flicker of pain the crack in my carefully built armor. And I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. Not today. Maybe not ever. The casket itself was beautiful in a cold, impersonal way. Dark cherry wood polished to a near mirror, finished with Richard Bennett's name engraved in gleaming gold letters. Beloved brother, father, uncle. The words blurred as my eyes unfocused. Father write a title more ceremonial than factual, at least in my world. The chapel was saturated with the sickly sweet scent of lilies, mingled with the heavy musk of burning candle wax. That cloying aroma clung to everything, skin clothes, even the back of your throat. It was the smell of funerals, of endings. The air felt thick, like grief had become a physical thing pressing down on my shoulders. Outside, I sat still composed. Inside, I was unraveling at the seams. My heartbeat pounded steadily like a muted war drum against my ribcage. My palms were damp, my spine rigid. Every instinct screamed at me to get up, to escape, to run. But I stayed rooted. Not out of obligation, but because retreating would feel like defeat. Across from me, Aunt Evelyn observed me like a hawk, sizing up weak prey. She tilted her head, eyes narrowing, lips curling into that familiar expression that danced between pity and triumph. She'd always despised me, perhaps, because once long ago my parents had been happy together, briefly, before the cracks appeared, before everything fell apart. And Evelyn had enjoyed every moment of my discomfort ever since. Jake lounged beside her, sprawling with an effortless arrogance. His arm draped across the pew, his fingers drumming a lazy rhythm. He carried himself with the smug certainty of someone who knew he was Richard's favorite, the son my father never had but claimed in every way that mattered. Even his smirk was inherited, a mirror image of the one my father used to wear. A few rows ahead, my mother, Maggie Bennett, sat with my brother Luke. Mom looked smaller than I remembered. More fragile, like life had been quietly wearing her down grain by grain. Luke caught my gaze for a fleeting second, offered a brief, sympathetic look, then turned away. He'd always been the neutral party, the one who learned early that keeping your head down was the only way to survive in this family. I didn't resent him for it. How could I? In this family, neutrality wasn't just a choice, it was self-defense. I swallowed hard, pushing down the bitter lump rising in my throat, and forced my attention to the front of the chapel where Father Michael Thompson stood. He had been there for every milestone, baptisms, weddings, now this. His voice filled the room, soft and measured, delivering a eulogy that painted Richard Bennett as a pillar of strength and unwavering commitment to family. But his words floated past me like dust motes. That version of my father didn't match the man I knew. The man who could spend days pretending I didn't exist. The man who once looked me in the eye and told me I was too emotional, as if feeling things deeply was a personal failing. This tidy, reverent obituary being recited didn't belong to him. It was a stranger's story. Then Father Thompson paused, clearing his throat in a way that seemed to reset the air itself. "There is one final message," he announced, his gaze sweeping the congregation. "A letter left by Richard. He asked that it be read aloud here today." The room seemed to contract, the very walls leaning in. Even the soft patter of rain against the stained glass quieted. Aunt Evelyn tensed her back, going ramrod straight. Jake's nonchalant posture shifted. His fingers stopped their lazy tapping. A letter, my breath caught. No one had said a word about a letter. I looked up, and there it was. A time-worn envelope, its edges frayed, clutched delicately in Father Thompson's hands. The sight of it made my stomach pitch. My fingers tingled, my pulse quickened as if my body understood before my mind could catch up. A part of me wanted to bolt to escape before those words, whatever they were, could reach me. But something small, stubborn and tired of running, rooted me in place. I needed to hear it, even if it hurt, even if it dismantled me. Father Thompson unfolded the paper with a kind of reverence, smoothing the creases with trembling fingers. Then he began to read. To those gathered here, my family, my regrets, and the daughter I never had the courage to love. The words dropped into the chapel's silence like a stone into deep water. The murmurs ceased. The practiced smiles faltered. Time seemed to hold its breath. I learned early on that invisibility could be a survival tactic, a kind of self-preservation. If I kept my voice soft, barely above a whisper, if I made my body small shoulders, hunched head down, hands folded neatly in my lap, they would forget I existed. And truthfully, most of the time they did. Their attention was a fickle, selective thing, always seeking out the louder, shinier, more palatable presences in the room. I was none of those things. So as I stepped into the familiar hush of St. Mary's Chapel, 7 years after I'd sworn never to set foot here again, it was almost as if time had folded back on itself. The cracked tile beneath my boots bore the same jagged lines like fault lines waiting to split open. The floral-patterned carpet still exhaled that damp, suffocating blend of mildew and artificial roses, a scent that clung to the air like a bad memory. And the faces, oh, the faces still skimmed over me as if I were nothing more than a faint outline, a blurred shadow barely worth acknowledging. But I was not the same girl who had fled this town. I had shed that brittle version of myself somewhere between cold Chicago winters and long, solitary nights, where silence felt less like a punishment and more like peace. Yet as I stood among these people, I couldn't help but wonder if they were even capable of seeing the woman I had become. Or would they insist on seeing only the ghost they had always known? My name is Claire Bennett, I reminded myself silently, as though reciting a litany of identity. I'm 29. I live 3 states away. I built a life so distant from this suffocating place, it barely feels real to be back. But reality had a cruel way of catching up. The phone call had come unexpectedly, crackling with bad reception and worse news. Luke's voice had trembled something it rarely did. Claire, he had said, his words weighted Dad's gone. It was a stroke. Fast. Sudden. I remembered the pause that followed, the kind of silence that hummed with everything unsaid. I couldn't bring myself to hang up. Couldn't pretend indifference. I told myself I could handle it, a quick, strategic return. Pay my respects, endure the family's predictable coldness, and leave before the old wounds reopened. But the moment I crossed that threshold, the weight of it all slammed into my chest. That oppressive, invisible hand pressing down, stealing breath. The same suffocating tension that had filled my father's house, where affection was rationed and silence was the preferred currency. When I arrived at the wake, Luke greeted me with an embrace that was unexpectedly tight, as though afraid that if he let go, I might disappear all over again. His breath was warm against my ear as he whispered, "I'm glad you came." And for once I believed him. His words were not wrapped in obligation, not coated with the polite venom this family so often wielded. Our mother, Maggie Bennett, stood a few steps behind him. Her smile was gentle but distant, as though offering politeness from behind a glass wall. She looked diminished, not in stature, but in presence. Time had chipped away at her vibrancy so slowly, so cruelly, that you wouldn't notice unless you had been absent long enough to see the contrast. She had stayed in this town even after the divorce, tethered by habit, or perhaps by fear, I couldn't be sure. And then there was Evelyn Parker, my father's only sibling, who spotted me from across the room like a predator locking onto wounded prey. She didn't wave. Didn't offer the brittle pleasantries most people default to in moments like these. No. Evelyn simply stared, her lips curving into a smile so thin it could have been mistaken for a sneer, as though I were some unsightly blemish she had discovered on her reflection. She had always taken a perverse joy in reminding me of my place or lack thereof. Jake Parker, her son, had been raised as the crowned heir of family approval, basking in a glow that was never meant for me. To him, I was little more than background noise, a foil to his golden boy narrative. And there he was polished and perfect, dressed in an expensive tailored suit that seemed more suited for a corporate gala than a funeral. His smirk hadn't aged a day. If anything, it had sharpened. He barely acknowledged my presence. When his gaze did flicker towards me, it carried the same infuriating, condescending tilt that had once made me want to scream. We had scattered ourselves across the chapel not by design, but by the unspoken rule of fractured families. Islands of silence, each avoiding the gravitational pull of old resentments. As the pews filled familiar faces, neighbors, former colleagues of Richard Bennett parishioners, filed in murmuring quietly as they took their seats. To them, he had been a good man, reliable, a man of principle. Their eulogies spoken in low reverence painted a portrait of strength and integrity. But their Richard was not my father. My father was the man who never once attended a school play, who barely spared a glance at my clumsy childhood art projects, who once told me with chilling finality, "You're just like your mother." A verdict, not a compliment. And yet, despite it all, there I sat, swathed in black hands folded, doing my best not to feel, not to remember, not to admit that some part of me still longed pathetically for a scrap of proof that he had at some point cared. Then Father Michael Thompson announced the letter. The shift in the room was almost imperceptible, a subtle straightening of backs, the faint rustle of bodies leaning forward, curiosity sharpening the air like static before a storm. The name Richard Bennett hung heavy in the silence. Aunt Evelyn's posture stiffened, her ever-present smugness flickering into something more brittle, less certain. Across the aisle, Jake's fingers stilled against his knee, his casual rhythm halted mid-beat. His gaze slid toward the pulpit, the first hint of unease clouding his otherwise infallible composure. But me, I froze. A letter. My thoughts spun wildly. He had never written to me, not when I left, not when I graduated, not even after I sent that final desperate email, the one I had agonized over rewriting and rephrasing, until all that remained was a single brutal line, "I'm done trying." No reply had ever come. So what on earth could be in that letter? My throat constricted as I watched Father Thompson handle the envelope, his fingers reverent, almost reluctant. The paper was yellowed, its edges softened with age, as though it had been waiting patient and damning for this very moment. I fought to steady my breathing, but my chest betrayed me, rising and falling in shallow, uneven bursts. I pressed my fingertips against the rough grain of the pew, grounding myself with its splintered reality. "Don't cry," I commanded silently. "Don't let them see you unravel." Evelyn leaned toward Jake, her whisper a venomous thread too faint to catch, but the slow, knowing curl of his lips said enough. He was so sure he knew what was coming. But for once so was I, and that terrified me. It was easy to imagine what would come next. Probably some carefully crafted tribute, another polished farewell designed to cement Jake Parker's perfect image as the heir of Richard Bennett's legacy. A final public affirmation of the things my father held sacred: discipline, reputation control, especially when those virtues could be conveniently paraded around someone else's name. Never mine, always Jake's. Yet when Father Michael Thompson cleared his throat once more, the subtle sheen of sweat glistening at his temple gave me pause. He was uneasy, nervous even. That surprised me. This was a man who had presided over countless rites of passage in our family, from christenings to weddings, always composed, always detached. But today, with that envelope trembling in his hands, he looked as if the weight of its contents was more than mere paper. A knot coiled tighter in my stomach, twisting with each silent second. What had my father written? Why did my fingers feel so cold, as if the blood had retreated in anticipation of something unforgiving? Why, of all moments, did I suddenly wish I had never come back to this town, never stepped into this chapel that seemed to close in on me like a coffin itself? Somewhere behind me, a cough cut through the heavy stillness, a small dry sound that echoed far louder than it should have in the cavernous space. Every noise seemed amplified now, the subtle shuffle of restless feet against the stone floor, the creaking protest of aged wooden pews, even the persistent whisper of rain tapping against stained glass windows. The world was holding its breath, counting down in slow, deliberate beats. Tick, tick, tick. I could feel eyes on me. Luke, seated a few rows across, cast me a glance tinged with that familiar mixture of worry and quiet understanding. Maybe he knew something was coming, or maybe he just knew me too well, knew how brittle I felt beneath my carefully composed exterior. He had always been the one who tried in his quiet way to understand what it was like growing up as a daughter, in a house that never quite knew what to do with daughters. Our mother, Maggie Bennett, sat beside him, her posture ramrod straight hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned a ghostly shade of white. Her silence spoke louder than any eulogy. My gaze drifted back to the casket at the front of the chapel. Smooth cherry wood gleaming under the muted light, the gold engraving of my father's name catching reflections like a cruel mockery. It felt as though Richard Bennett himself was still here, orchestrating this entire moment from beyond the grave, pulling invisible strings with the same calculating precision he'd always employed. He had always known how to command a room, how to make his presence felt in silence as much as in speech. And now, even in death, he had the floor, the final word. An urge to scream clawed at my throat. Another to run. But I remained anchored, bracing myself with the grim certainty that whatever truths lay folded within that letter, they would not be simple, nor would they be kind. And somewhere deep in the hollow of my gut, I knew this was going to be about me. I should have left. Every instinct honed sharp over years of disappointment begged me to stand, to walk out of that suffocating chapel, to let the cool sting of rain wash away the dread as I vanished back into anonymity. I could already feel the imagined slap of wind against my face, hear the rhythmic thud of my boots on wet pavement, the satisfying finality of putting distance again between myself and this family. No one would have stopped me, not Evelyn, who would have relished my retreat as yet another confirmation of my inadequacy. She might have even smiled victorious in her own bitter way, but I didn't move. I sat, every muscle tense, as Father Thompson unfolded the letter, his hands trembling just enough to betray him. The slow, deliberate way he adjusted his glasses, the careful clearing of his throat, the brief, almost imperceptible pause, as his eyes skimmed the page, it was all so meticulous, yet laced with an undercurrent of unease. He had read something there he hadn't expected. A shiver rippled up my spine, cold and electric. I should have left. I knew it. But beneath the layers of resentment, beneath the calloused scar tissue left by years of being overlooked, there lingered something far more dangerous. Hope. A fragile, shameful flicker of it. The kind of hope that makes fools out of people, that persists, even when logic demands its extinction. I hated that it lived inside me still. After every dismissive glance, every conversation where my existence was an afterthought, after every time he chose Jake over me, that ember of hope continued to smolder. Maybe this letter was different. Maybe it was an apology. A confession. The truth I had starved for all my life. And that thought terrified me more than any insult, more than any silence. Because what if it wasn't? What if it was worse? The pulpit blurred at the edges as my heart pounded, a relentless rhythm so loud it eclipsed the gentle whir of ceiling fans and the restless rustle of the gathered mourners. The room felt suspended, trapped in that precarious space between the past and the truth this letter was poised to unleash. Jake shifted beside Evelyn, his jaw-tightening fingers curling into tense fists. His eyes darted toward the letter, betraying a rare flicker of unease, as though he feared what was coming. Evelyn, ever the portrait of control, sat rigid, arms folded in a mockery of poise, but the thin, bloodless line of her lips betrayed her. I lowered my gaze to my lap. My hands clenched around the edge of the pew had gone stark white. Slowly, deliberately, I unfurled my fingers, folding them together to mask the tremor. You've handled worse, I told myself, though the words felt hollow. But had I? Because this wasn't just a letter. It was the final act of a man who had spent his life defining me by his silence. And I didn't know what would be worse, being forgotten within its folds, or being remembered for all the wrong reasons. Then finally Father Thompson's gaze lifted from the page. His eyes found mine, and in that fleeting moment something shifted between us. Not pity, not quite. Something heavier. He knew. Whatever was written there, he knew it would land like a stone in my chest. He opened his mouth to speak, and I knew this was it, the moment I had spent years running from, carrying like a phantom weight. But I didn't flinch. I didn't run. because for once I needed to face it. The pain, the truth, the raw, unfiltered remnants of a relationship that had never been what it should have been. I needed to hear the words my father had saved for the very end, even if they broke me, even if they shattered the fragile constructs I had built to protect myself, not just from him, but from the version of me I feared might be real. I inhaled, slowly bracing myself as Father Thompson began to read. The first words fell into the hush like a stone shattering the fragile stillness of water. To those gathered here, my family, my regrets, and the daughter I never had the courage to love. The syllables lingered in the air, heavier than the dust motes swirling lazily in the shafts of stained glass light. For a heartbeat, perhaps two, I forgot to breathe. It was as if time, that sly architect of distance, had folded in on itself, compressing every wound, every silence, every look that never lingered long enough into this single blistering moment. This was not the blow I had braced for, but it struck all the same. All around me the atmosphere rippled. Heads turned with the slow, deliberate curiosity of people witnessing a secret unravel. Eyes once comfortably indifferent now darted toward me sharp with new awareness. Somewhere nearby, a breath hitched audibly. And then, as if reality itself had shifted, I watched Jake Parker's signature smirk, fracture uncertainty flickering across his once unchallenged facade. Beside him, Evelyn Parker straightened in her seat, the color leaching from her face until she resembled a portrait drained of life. But me, I remained motionless, rooted not by strength, but by the sheer gravity of those words. Because in that simple confession, something inside me gave way. Something brittle and ancient, a shard of grief I hadn't even realized I was still carrying. Father Michael Thompson's voice softened each word delivered with the care of a man tiptoeing through sacred ground. To Claire, if you are there, then I am already surprised. I did not expect you would come. And if you didn't, I understand. I earned your absence. A sharp pain bloomed against the inside of my cheek as I bit down hard, the metallic tang of blood grounding me. He was speaking directly to me, my father, through lips no longer capable of speech, through hands that had never learned the language of tenderness. The letter was his mouthpiece now, and every sentence carved deeper than the last. You were always the mirror I didn't want to look into. You reflected back the parts of myself I spent a lifetime trying to bury: sensitivity, defiance, that stubborn need to be understood, rather than obeyed. The chapel had become a vacuum swallowing even the soft shuffle of restless bodies. Not a cough, not a rustle. Even the rain, persistent all morning, seemed to hush in reverence. It was as if the entire world had conspired to bear witness. When you were born, I convinced myself there was time to figure out how to love you, how to speak your language. But time is a liar, and I let the silence between us grow until it became a living thing stronger than my own voice. An unfamiliar heat bloomed in my chest, but it wasn't anger, nor was it sadness. It was grief in its purest form, not for what had been lost, but for what had never existed. A phantom ache for the bond we never built. I let others define you while I stood by. I let them shape the narrative of who you were, angry, difficult, distant, because it was easier than admitting my own failure. Easier than confessing that I didn't know how to father you, that I failed you. From the corner of my eye, I saw Evelyn shift uncomfortably, her arms crossed in a defensive tangle across her chest. Her expression was blank, but a flush had crept up her neck, betraying her simmering discomfort. Jake, once so effortlessly composed, now stared fixedly at the floor. His hand clenched into a fist against his thigh, as though trying to grip onto his crumbling certainty. I watched you walk out of my life carrying every wound I gave you, and still I did nothing. My throat constricted, but no tears came. It wasn't that simple. This wasn't the kind of grief that demanded release. This was recognition, raw, jagged, and relentless. And yet, amidst the ache, his words carved a strange, hollow space where resentment had once thrived. You were never my regret, Claire. Not once. You were my lesson. You were my mirror. And if life had given me one more chance, I would have learned to love you better. My lips quivered. My nails dug into the tender flesh of my palms, anchoring me in the here and now, as Father Thompson carefully turned the page, the paper trembling faintly between his fingers. To Jake, to Evelyn, to those who thought they knew me, I allowed your version of me to persist, because I was too much a coward to defend the man I truly was. My silence was never approval. It was fear. And for that I am sorry. The air seemed to fracture, releasing a tension that had held the entire chapel hostage. Jake looked stunned, blindsided by the revelation. Evelyn sat like a statue, her face carved in stone, but even she couldn't disguise the way her shoulders hunched inward as though the very air had turned against her. Yet for me, it felt as though I could breathe for the first time in years. The crushing weight of invisibility lifted, if only slightly. And then the final blow. To my daughter, if you hear this, I love you. I always did. I simply never knew how to show it. But I see you now. The letter ended, and with its final line, so too did the narrative I had carried my entire life, the lie that I was unwanted, unseen, unworthy. Because in that moment, from beyond the grave, he saw me. The chapel remained suspended in that strange, fragile quiet. No one spoke. No one applauded. His name was not uttered. It was as though everyone had been pulled into the same raw, bewildered space I now occupied, each of us, grappling with the pieces of a story we thought we understood. The letter had left its wreckage behind, not the kind that could be swept away or repaired, but the kind that forced everyone to look at each other and themselves with new, uncomfortable clarity. I looked toward Evelyn, and for the first time in my life she appeared small. Not angry, not smug, just lost. Jake's smirk was nowhere to be found. He sat slouched, staring at the floor, his bravado stripped bare. And my mother, my quiet, patient mother, had tears pooling in her eyes. Small, glistening tears that shimmered, but did not fall. Slowly she reached across Luke, her fingers, finding mine curling around them in a gesture so simple yet monumental. We hadn't touched in years. Yet in that moment, it felt as natural as breathing. When the service ended, the congregation dispersed in uneasy clusters. The usual murmured condolences were absent. Few dared meet my gaze. Some averted their eyes, perhaps ashamed of the reflections they had seen. Others, like Father Thompson, offered me a lingering, gentle look, an unspoken acknowledgement. I remained behind, standing sentinel beside the casket, the silence no longer suffocating, but contemplative. I didn't need to speak. Words would have been redundant. Instead, I let the weight of everything what had been said, what had been left unsaid, settle into my bones. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't angry, not in that moment. What I felt in those final moments was not a tidal wave of grief, nor the searing release of rage I had imagined might come. No, what settled into my bones was something quieter, more melancholic, regret, but not my own. His. Because those words, that letter, were an offering brought far too late. There would be no moments of softened glances exchanged across a dinner table, no tentative reconciliations built on shared truths, no hearing my father's voice, his real voice, speaking those words aloud, unshielded by paper and posthumous courage. All those questions that had made a home in the hollow of my chest would remain unanswered. The ache of what could have been was permanent. And yet amidst the emptiness I had been given something, truth. A brittle, imperfect, but undeniable truth, and that more than I had ever dared to hope for was enough. Standing there with the weight of my father's last confession still heavy in the air, I found myself whispering 3 words I never thought would pass my lips, not for him. I forgive you, not because he had earned it, not because the scales had somehow been balanced, but because I was tired of dragging his silence behind me like a rusted chain. Tired of measuring my worth against the cold metric of his indifference. That bitterness had lived within me far too long, shaping my edges, hardening my heart, in ways I no longer wished to carry forward. It ends here. After the burial, I found myself in the parking lot, leaning against my car, the cold metal beneath my palms, grounding me in the present. The overcast sky mirrored the hollow weight in my chest, but for the first time, the heaviness did not suffocate. Beside me, Luke appeared without ceremony, taking his place silently at my side. We stood there shoulder to shoulder, both facing forward, as if afraid that looking at each other might crack the fragile calm we'd found. After a stretch of wordless companionship, he spoke. I think he meant it. The simplicity of his words struck me harder than any elaborate eulogy. I nodded, letting the admission settle between us. I do too. Then, softer, barely above a whisper, he added, You deserved better. A slow, small smile curved my lips, the first real smile of the day. "So did you," I said, and we both knew it was the truest thing spoken all afternoon. We didn't embrace. There were no tears, no cinematic gestures of reconciliation. But we stood there together longer than we ever had before. And that, in its own quiet way, felt like the beginning of something new. Later that night, back in the hollow quiet of my hotel room, I unzipped my suitcase. Buried between layers of carefully folded clothes, my fingers brushed against an old photograph I had packed without thinking. I pulled it free, smoothing its time-worn edges with a reverence I hadn't expected. It was a picture of me, no more than 6 years old, proudly holding up a finger painting a chaotic burst of color that made no sense, but radiated the unfiltered joy of childhood creation. In the blurred background stood my father. His face was indistinct, unreadable, a shadow more than a presence. But tonight, looking at that image through the lens of his letter, I wondered if maybe he had been proud. Perhaps he simply lacked the tools, the language to express it. Perhaps his silence had been more about his own failings than my worth. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe it. I was no longer invisible, not to him, and more importantly, not to myself. Sometimes the dead say what the living never could, and when they do, it either fractures you beyond repair, or it sets you free. Tonight it felt like freedom. As you sit with this story, mine, yet perhaps yours in some small way, I invite you to take a breath. A deep, intentional breath. Because we all carry stories like this. Some of them loud, demanding to be heard. Others buried deep, quietly shaping the way we see ourselves. But here's the truth, sharing them matters. If this story stirred something in you, if it made you pause, reflect, ache, or maybe heal, then I hope you'll take a moment to click that like button. It's a small gesture, but it helps more people find these kinds of stories. The ones we don't always know we need until we hear them. And if you've ever lived through something similar, if you carry your own version of this letter, this silence, this ache, I would love to hear from you. Drop a comment below. I read every single one, and I mean that. Stories, when shared, can be a balm, not just for the teller, but for the listener. If someone you know needs to hear this today, share it with them. You never know whose unspoken hurt might be waiting for words like these. And if you're new here, welcome. This is a space for stories that cut deep, heal slow, and dare to speak the truths most people shy away from. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more. Until next time, be gentle with yourself. You're not alone.